treat to be here. I've always heard about Budapest, and I've always heard wonderful things about it. In fact, my parents had friends here and thoroughly enjoyed their visits. But this weekend is my first trip here, and I just want to express how much I've loved meeting people in this beautiful city. And in spite of the weather not being quite perfect, it's been a very, very nice day. And I appreciate all of you being here this evening. I would especially like to start off by thanking Zoe Palco and the Explorer Society Foundation, Irvin Laszlo and others for inviting me here. This is a great honor, and I think Budapest has in many ways been a center of art and science for a very long time, so it's very fitting that we can have a discussion of this level about where science, spirit, and humanity are headed. And that, to me, is I'm very passionate about this topic because, as you heard in the introduction, when you saw the slides during the music, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that our world, it doesn't appear to be in perfect harmony. And in fact, there's a tremendous amount of ongoing conflict and challenge. And this is something that is very much a result of human activity. And in many ways, in spite of ourselves calling ourselves Homo sapiens, sapiens meaning wise, I would say if you look at a lot of what our species is doing right now, it doesn't appear to be so wise. And I'll be talking a bit about how we've gotten to that stage, but also about some beautiful solutions moving forward, because I think a lot of the energy of that polarization of our current world is an energy that we can use to flip and to start really being responsible for our choices and start living the lives that will honor all human beings and protect our fellow inhabitants of this planet. Because at the current time, we're not really doing that. And it's really time to shift. So I want to tell you my story, and my story is one that I think some of you are probably familiar with from the book Proof of Heaven. However, there's a lot more to the story than that. Proof of Heaven, I look at that book, I look at as a question mark. All it does is say we can have these extraordinary, inexplicable experiences, at least inexplicable by a lot of our conventional science. But the reality is I am a scientist, and I grew up in a scientific home. My father had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War. He was in the Pacific Theater. He had a very strong belief in God. He had gotten that from his own father, who was a general surgeon in eastern Tennessee. And I think my dad came back from almost 2 years in the Pacific Theater relatively intact because of his strong belief in God. Now, he came back to the United States and became a chairman of a neurosurgical training program. And then he went on to global renown as a neurosurgeon, an academic neurosurgeon, kind of leading the way into new ways to do things and take care of our patients. Now, for him, there was never any conflict whatsoever between the science he knew, the science he taught other neurosurgeons, and his belief in an infinitely powerful and loving God. He knew the power of prayer. It was an essential part of his medical practice. Now, growing up in that family was a real gift to me. And yes, he did take me to that Methodist church growing up. Every Sunday I went to church. But I remember in 6th grade when I was getting confirmed, getting into a very deep discussion with my church leaders who were trying to confirm me about science and how science is the pathway to truth. Well, it is. But the science that I worshipped before my coma, and I do not use that word lightly, reductive materialism, the conventional form of science that held sway really up until about 100 years ago, although it still holds sway with much of the world, has been disproven. Quantum physics has completely become the most proven field in the history of science. And yet, underneath the experiments is a profound mystery. That profound mystery is something that has been more and more refined in recent years. We're starting to glimpse the light at the end of the tunnel. But in fact, that deep mystery, as many of the founding fathers of quantum physics admitted, revealed that consciousness, there's something about consciousness and conscious awareness that seems to completely contain the physical world within it. And yet, that has been a very tough pill to swallow. I'll talk about that a little more as we go along. But I want to just start by saying I worship that science for much of my life, for the first 54 years of my life. And as much as I wanted to believe all that I had heard in that Methodist church growing up in North Carolina, after training at Duke University, where I spent 8 years, and then a fellowship up in Newcastle, England, I went back to the United States and had a job at Harvard Medical School. And that's where I taught neurosurgery for 15 years. I thought I had some idea of how brain and mind and consciousness work. There are some ideas in neuroscience about all that. But fact of the matter is, I really was clueless about the depth of what is known as the hard problem of consciousness. And that is not just a statement out of frustration from a scientist investigating the brain, but it is actually a deep philosophical problem that has emerged over the last probably 30 years or so in trying to connect the workings of the brain with human mental experience and thought and how we gain knowledge. And I would say that a lot of the revolutionary thinking in that scientific effort to explain the mind-brain connection is leading to an entirely new and very informed science that goes far beyond the simplistic and bleak fiction of materialist science, or what is known as physicalism, the notion that only the physical world exists, that there is nothing else, that things like thoughts and emotions, concepts, ideas are nothing more than the product of the molecular reactions, chemical reactions, and the electron fluxes in the substance of the brain. And what we're discovering is no, that's absolutely wrong. Consciousness cannot be explained by the workings of the brain. And there are things that we can know far beyond the ken of our physical senses that completely defy the idea that consciousness is created by the brain. But this is all getting a bit ahead of myself. I want to tell you how I got here. And to do that, I have to take you back to November of 2008. And that's when I went into coma. Leading up to that time, I was leading a very comfortable life, very kind of assured that I thought I understood many of these concepts that were then thrown into deep question. And that's when I woke up at 4:30 in the morning on November 10th, 2008, with severe back pain. Made my way down the hall into a hot bathtub, hoping that would alleviate some of the pain, and I almost couldn't get out of the tub. It was a horrific pain, and when I was finally able to baby step my way back to bed, tumble into bed in a cold sweat, I realized I had a horrific headache. And of course, anyone out there with any kind of medical education, if they hear about a sudden onset of severe headache and back pain, meningitis might come to mind. But in fact, my brain was already being overrun by this extremely primitive, aggressive, and should have killed me gram-negative bacterial infection that was minute by minute taking away all of my capacity to understand anything. One of my last memories of that morning was when my youngest son, his name is Bond, he came in the room and realized Dad was in horrific pain. And I remember he started rubbing my temples to make me feel better. And that just showed me what a horrific headache I had, worse than anything I could describe. And I remember lying there and thinking as he was getting ready to go off to school, you know, if this really gets worse, I might have to go to the emergency room. And if that happens, I'd been to that emergency room before. I'd worked there for several years seeing patients, and I realized, oh my gosh, all the questions and filling out the forms, and I thought, well, at the end of it all, it'll be just this embarrassment when my headache starts getting better, and I say, well, thank you all, I'll go home now. And I thought maybe I would be late that day when Bond came home from school, that I might miss him. And I remember telling him, have a good day at school, Bond. That's the last thing I remember. From then on, I was deep in coma. And much of the story that I tell in the book Proof of Heaven has to do with a lot of what happened around me during that 7 days that I was in deep coma with this should have killed me bacterial meningitis. And I know that what I was told later by family and by a lot of my doctors and nurses who took care of me is that they took me to the emergency room. I was already deep in coma and having grand mal epileptic seizures. And Dr. Laura Potter was my ER physician. And I had worked side by side with her for several years, sharing patients in that emergency room. Well, she didn't even recognize me. The nurses told her there's an extremely ill patient seizing in Major Bay 10. She went in there and worked on me for about 10 minutes before she even recognized me. And she was shocked. She knew already that the history was I'd gone from symptom onset into deep coma in only 3.5 hours. She was smart enough to think this might be meningitis. And when she put a needle into my lower back, of course, I remember none of that. I was gone from this world. But she did a lumbar puncture, and out came thick white pus under pressure. And she told me many months later that when she saw that, knowing how quickly I'd gone into coma, and then getting a report back from microbiology that it was gram-negative rods, she knew I was in deep trouble. In fact, she estimated I had a 10% chance of survival. That was the rosy prognosis early on that Monday morning, my first day in coma. The next day, my doctors got a big shock. Report back from microbiology was that it was E. coli. Now, if you do a medical literature search, you'll find that E. coli meningitis in adults is extremely rare. In fact, almost all cases of E. coli meningitis occur in newborns. It's very rare to have E. coli meningitis if you're older than 3 months of age. Well, I have to live with that. I have to defend my level of maturity. But I promise you, that was a big challenge to my doctors to try and understand all this. They had me on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics. I'd been put on a ventilator right out of the emergency room, up on a medical intensive care bed, and things just got worse and worse. The lab data looked extremely vexing. My doctors had never seen such a severe case of bacterial meningitis. One thing that got their attention was the level of glucose in my cerebrospinal fluid. In most anybody in this room, that level would be 60 to 80 milligrams per deciliter. In a very sick meningitis patient, that glucose level might drop to 20. My glucose level was at 1. Nobody had seen anything like that. My neurologic exams showed how sick I was. There's something called the Glasgow Coma Scale, which is a 15-point scale, although they only use 12 of those points, because at 15 would be anybody in this room. In other words, we're not in coma. But then if you get to 9, you're already in deep coma. Anything below 9 is a very deep coma. And 3 is a corpse. That whole week I was in the hospital, my Glasgow Coma Scale ranged from 6 to 7. And I was deathly ill. The CT and MRI scans showed that it was a full thickness injury to my neocortex. Modern neuroscience postulates that all details of conscious awareness, everything that I experience when I look out at this room, everything I hear, all of my executive function, planning, thinking, linguistic brain, language, rational thought, every bit of it, all of processing and sensory information, everything about what we know about our, what's around our bodies, every bit of that depends on the neocortex. It's a 6 cell layers thick region, covers the entire brain, and that is what makes us human. That is why meningitis is such a perfect model of human death. Because in meningitis, especially a severe case like mine, you destroy that entire neocortex. Now it turns out that a lot of the work that I did on this and reported in Proof of Heaven has been greatly validated by a medical report that was done on my medical record, a case report. And it came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases back in September of 2018. So it's fairly recent. It was written by 3 physicians who were fascinated by my miraculous recovery. I mean, any doctor who is aware of my medical records is shocked that I can stand here and put 2 words together, much less function like a normal human being, because of the damage to my neocortex. It was so well documented. And that case report, it's interesting to point out, they spent more than 2 years reviewing my medical records and writing it up, and then trying to get it published. Well, one of the problems was the peer reviewers at these medical journals thought this doesn't line up. This medical record is not someone who comes back and has a full recovery. In fact, that was what haunted me when I first started reviewing my medical records in the first month or 2 after my coma. When I go back and see my doctors for checkups, they would examine me, we'd talk about my case, I go through some of the scans and medical records, and it was very haunting because this was not a case of someone who survived. And in fact, the doctors who wrote up my case had trouble getting it published for that very same reason. And finally, they did get it published because one of the journals, the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, was wondering, well, do you have an explanation for the miraculous recovery? And my doctors did. It turns out that they were familiar with other near-death experience cases that had resulted in miraculous healing, inexplicable by Western medical standards. In fact, there are quite a number of those cases out there. For example, Anita Morjani, she wrote a book called Dying to Be Me. And back in February 2006, she was 4 years into a diagnosis of advanced lymphoma and was taken into a Hong Kong emergency room, weighed 85 pounds. She was in deep coma. Any doctor reading her medical record would say she'd be dead within 12 hours, without question. Well, she had a profound spiritual experience that she describes in her book, where she was liberated into spiritual form and could see her brother, who was flying from India to Hong Kong to be with her as she died. And she saw her father, who had already passed over. And he helped her to come to an understanding of this. And she actually came back to this world because she knew her cancer would disappear. She came back and her cancer vanished. And that's just one example. But Anita Morjani, there's another case in the United States that's quite well known. Dr. Mary C. Neal, an orthopedic surgeon who was kayaking in Chile back in the late 1990s. And her kayak was shoved under a waterfall into boulders, broke both her legs, pinned her underwater. She was underwater for more than 30 minutes. When they brought her back to the top, she was dead. They resuscitated her and she came back, but she also had a very profound experience. She went on to heal completely, and I promise you, 30-minute warm water drowning, people don't come back. Hers was absolutely a miraculous healing with no explanation in Western medicine. And so what these doctors who were trying to get my case report published told those peer reviewers was that they explained my excellent recovery because of the spiritual content of my near-death experience. So I think that tells you the medical community is coming a long way quickly to understanding what these cases mean and how important they are. So I want to take you back into my journey. So there I was in deep coma, and what was going on for me? Well, in a setting where the doctors, the medical records all agreed that my brain was too damaged, with full thickness damage of all 8 lobes of my brain, I could not have had any kind of dream, hallucination, confabulation. I would have no mental experience at all. That's what Western medicine and this, our conventional science would predict. Well, the fact is I had an extraordinary, robust, more real experience than anything I've had in my life. And it was an incredible teacher. It all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. It's kind of like being in dirty jello, and I have a very strong memories of this entire experience. And it was like I was surrounded by roots or blood vessels, just this very kind of rich, alive texture. But it was very murky, foreboding, kind of like being underground in depth. And I know a lot of times when I would tell this story, way back in the early days of my experience, people would often ask, well, was that some kind of hell or purgatory? Well, I would think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And this place, what I call the earthworm eye view, was nothing of the sort. Even though an important thing to point out about my whole NDE is that I was amnesic, that I had no memory whatsoever for the life of Eben Alexander. In fact, I had no language, no words, all my religious concepts completely gone, all my personal memories completely gone, and certainly all my scientific knowledge of brain and mind and consciousness, physics, cosmology, every bit of it completely erased. Now, early on, when I was recovering and things were coming back to me, I explained all that by saying, well, I guess that kind of extensive, terrific damage to the entire neocortex might damage your memory. Well, the interesting thing is over about 2 months, all of my memories came back. And not only that, they were more complete after that return than many of those personal memories had been before coma. That was a real shocker. But it was a big lesson to me. Memories are not stored in the brain at all. And neurosurgeons have suspected that for some time now, given that we've never, ever had a case where there was a significant deletion of long-term memories by any kind of a neurosurgical resection. Now, it turns out that if you operate on the medial temporal lobes, you can damage the ability, the apparent ability of brain to convert short-term to long-term memories. But the point we're making here is the brain is not the producer of consciousness, and it is not the storage site for memories. I'll get into that a lot later because it becomes very important to some of the bigger aspects of this message that we have. So my doctors were able to get it published because of that expression of the spiritual element of healing. That our thoughts, beliefs, things like that, that our kind of well-being can be something where the universe can engage and help us. Now, on my journey, I did not feel at any time like I was really guiding it. I did not feel like I had any kind of free will in this experience, but I was being shown so many things. Now, it turns out that when it all began in that earthworm eye view, I had no memory moment to moment to moment. So it seemed to be eternity. It seemed I'd always been there. And that's where when people would ask me, well, was it frightening or, horrifying? And no, it was the only reality I had ever known. So even though it sounds foreboding, for me it was just where I was. Well, luckily it didn't last forever because there came a slowly spinning white light. Very pure and clear. It was surrounded by fine silvery and golden tendrils. And it came out of this very kind of impure muck of the earthworm's eye view, where I'd been existing for such a long time. And as this light came spinning towards me, the most beautiful thing was it came with a musical melody. The only sound I had been aware of in that earthworm eye view was this pounding, smashing, steady, monotonous sound like someone banging on an anvil. And I don't know where that sound came from, but if it kept going forever, it definitely would have driven me crazy. That's why when this pure white light came towards me, slowly spinning, and came with a perfect musical melody that was associated with it, it was very alluring. And those musical notes of the melody turned out to be very important as the journey went on. I'll explain that in just a minute. But so this light opened up like a portal. It was a pathway, a tunnel, out of this ugly, foreboding earthworm eye view realm up into a rich, ultra-real place. The Gateway Valley is what I came to call it in my writings. It had many Earth-like features. And in this valley, I remember I had no body at all. There was never any kind of body awareness. and during this entire coma journey. But I was aware, I could sense things around me. And that's where I put together this incredible and beautiful scene of this realm. And there were sparkling waterfalls into these beautiful blue pools, and there was lush vegetation everywhere. No sign of any death or decay. This was really like a world of ideals. Everything was kind of perfect. And I remember not only witnessing the beautiful fragrances and the visuals of these flowers and all this plant life and buds on trees and all of it, this dynamic growth and just alive, pure, rich, fertile, and alive. Just a beautiful scene. And I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. And this was one of millions of other butterflies. And they were looping and spiraling in these vast formations above this valley. And I just remember being so taken in by this incredible scene. And the other thing that's important to point out is when we go to such realms and we have these experiences, it's not like just going to Disney World. And that's one of the reasons why our language is really very inadequate. And people often tell you after a near-death experience that it's ineffable, it's impossible to put into words. And one of the reasons, of course, is that language. And that our language is very primitive and imperfect, especially for describing such extensive journeys. And not just that, but our typical notion of a narrative and of time flow in this realm and how things seem to order and we seem to have a flow of causal events is not true there. You can experience tremendous waves of reality. In fact, one of the most common things that people describe in near-death experiences is the life review, where in fact you go through some of the residual lessons of your life. These are especially ones that are there to teach you. And so if you've given a lot of love and kindness and compassion out to people, that's what come back to you during your life review. And you get to bathe in all that beautiful glory. But if you've been busy handing out a lot of pain and suffering to other people, or being greedy or selfish, you get the business into that too. The interesting thing about a life review, when you talk to hundreds of people who have had them, and I've not only had my own version of a life review that I'll describe, but have had hundreds of my audience members share their life reviews with me, and of course I've read a tremendous amount of the literature on it. But the interesting thing about life reviews is you don't experience it as yourself. You experience it as the impact that your thoughts and actions have on others around you. You basically get their emotional read of your life. And that's what a life review is. It's a beautiful example of how we're so tempted in our culture to think we are a self. I've got my little thoughts, my little head, and so I'm a little self. I don't really have access to the thoughts of others. But in a life review, yes, you get a beautiful kind of objective view of who you are, because you feel that emotional impact. The other thing about a life review that's very crucial to point out is, for example, in somebody who has a cardiac arrest and has a profound near-death experience, but within 2 or 3 minutes they're resuscitated and come back to this world. Does that 2 or 3 minutes mean they didn't have a full life review? No, they have a complete life review. It can happen like that. But of course, time flow in this realm is part of the stage setting for the drama to unfold here. But there's a whole different ordering of time, what I call deep time, that orders the progression of souls in that realm from that perspective. And by progression of souls, I mean what happens lifetime after lifetime. And I'll be talking in a little while about the scientific evidence for reincarnation and how it's a crucial part of the concept of modern consciousness studies to have any understanding of that. So the life review, the way I saw life reviews, because I was amnesic, I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, but I had a very profound sense of life reviews because I was witnessing all of this and how all of this works. Just like anyone who has a near-death experience gets a tremendous amount of kind of information about how this is all working at a deeper level. And I know for me, the way that life reviews and reincarnation were shown to me, one was in this beautiful tapestry that I saw at a higher level of this journey. And that beautiful level of the tapestry showed all these individual threads of individual lifetimes, of sentient beings. Not just humans. This is about all sentience, aware beings. And these threads were woven all towards this beautiful, glowing center, which was the goal of our knowledge. And it was especially seeing the weave of that beautiful tapestry and realizing how that was showing me the material incarnations and then going back to the spiritual realm, then coming back in, all in a process of growth towards oneness with the divine. And I remember the other vision I had that showed me very clearly this notion of reincarnation and life reviews and how we're spiritual beings, but we come to earth temporarily being dumbed down. When we're here, we don't have the memories of our higher soul, although we can recover those through things like hypnosis and especially programs of meditation. And I use meditation daily. I've been meditating an hour to a day for the last 10 years now. And have used it to return to my NDE. It's very, very powerful. But going within mind is a beautiful tool to find out much more about who we are, what our relationships are, what our responsibility is, and how to guide our lives. And that's why I think it is so important. Because so much of what we think we know with our little linguistic brain and a lot of the kind of modern notions of humans and of our capabilities and of beliefs of our limitations, much of that is not necessarily so. We are in the process of learning much more about what humans can do. But to get back to the journey, so the other way that I saw life reviews and reincarnation and basically existence of sentient beings in this universe was like a school of flying fish. And when we were down in the water together, it's like we are here. We don't know all the knowledge that we have between lives. We've learned a lot. We're trying to learn our way through the universe and have our sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. And that's what we're trying to do. But then we would come up out of the water when I saw these flying fish. And that's when we were back up in the spiritual realm. That's when we would reunite with our higher soul, reunite with souls of departed loved ones, and then plan that next incarnation. And then dive back in, knowing that we were, that a lot of our knowledge from between lives was going to be temporarily deleted, because it takes that to come back into this world and live these lives in the way that we're supposed to for this drama to unfold. It's a drama of learning and of teaching, and that's what we're all here to do. That's what this is all about. There's a tremendous purpose to our existence. But this was something that had not been at all clear to me before, although it was becoming much clearer on this journey. Now, in that Gateway Valley, as I said, many Earth-like features. There were also souls or beings down below dancing. To me, I describe them all as souls between lives when I wrote all this up in the weeks after my coma, because that's what they appeared to be. Just basically the souls of individuals like all of us. But the thing that was so fascinating was lots of joy and merriment, festivities going on. And that was all because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs. And I saw them as kind of pure, kind of spherical beings of pure essence, just these golden, beautiful beings of light that were leaving sparkling golden trails against that blue-black velvety sky. The entire scene was lit with beautiful clouds of billowing color. And in that wonderful world, the good news about that Gateway Valley, on this butterfly wing with all the lush valley below me, all the souls dancing, the joy and merriment, children playing and dogs jumping, tremendous festivities. The best part about it was I wasn't alone. I had a companion on that butterfly wing. And those who have read the book Proof of Heaven will realize she ended up playing a tremendous role in this whole journey for me. And I remember, I remember perfectly what she looked like, sitting there beside me, very calm and loving presence. She looked at me with a look of pure love. Not like anything I'd ever experienced before, but a pure, unconditional love. And this soft, warm smile, high cheekbones, sparkling blue eyes, soft brown hair. She was wearing very simple garb, like all the people down in the valley below that were dancing in joy and merriment. And she never said a word to me, but she never had to, because her thoughts, her emotional truth and reality came directly into my awareness as we were sitting there together. And her message to me, I believe, is absolutely central as a message of the book Proof of Heaven, and certainly of my life since that coma, in talking about my journey and its ramifications. But that message from her was very clear. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of. Now the other statement that was very clear to me from her at that time was, you can do no wrong. And I wish I'd explained that a little better in Proof of Heaven, because some people take that totally the wrong way. Because by this time, in this beautiful Gateway Valley, I had already come to realize the much bigger mission of our lives, coming back to this world over and over again, all towards that oneness with the divine, all towards learning more about how we are connected and how we are here to show kindness, compassion, mercy, love for others. It's the only thing that matters. All this focus on accumulation of material wealth and controlling people and all of that is not our fundamental purpose here. And this is something that is pretty much a universal message from near-death experiencers. More than 95% of them would agree very solidly with this beautiful vision of how we're here to share love with each other and that nothing else matters. In fact, that goes all the way back to the very first NDE that I'm aware of. And that was written about more than 2,400 years ago by Plato. And he wrote about the Armenian soldier who was killed in battle. Dead on the battlefield several days, and when the battle was finally over and they put some of the generals up on a funeral pyre, they put up there, and he woke up. He came back to life. And boy, did he have a story to tell. But basically what he told his fellow soldiers 2,400 years ago, as reported by Plato, is in this life, the only thing that matters is how much love you can express with all of your fellow beings. And that when you leave your life and then go through this life review, because he described a life review, and that's where he said the only thing that matters is that love. And if you've been busy doing other things, you've been wasting your time and probably even taking steps backwards. That's why it's especially important to get our world back on track, because we've really lost sight of the goal in many ways, and that kind of fracture of our modern world, the breaking of our science and our technology from our human spirit, which is really a divorce of our highest human sensibilities that's occurred over the last 2 centuries or so. It's time to annul that divorce. It is time for science and spirit to get back together. And quantum physics is leading the way to help us go in that direction. I'll explain that more in just a few minutes, but I just want to finish telling you a little bit more about my journey before we get into the time since then and my joining with the scientific community in exploring consciousness and trying to come to a deeper explanation of all this. Now, in that Gateway Valley, in that beautiful realm, I already knew that when that guardian angel told me you can do no wrong, what she really meant was we're all here to live, to love others, and to share mercy and compassion with all of our fellow beings. And in that sense, I knew that all the actions that we take in this life, when we go through that life review, in that beautiful, loving setting, with that infinitely healing God force present, that God force is a pure love. It's like being home. It's our true spiritual home. It's much more at home than this world is. That's why so many near-death experiencers say they just let all this go, let their material body go, and continue in that realm forever. Except many of them make the choice to come back, just as I did, for a loved one or for loved ones. Come back to this world. Because that existence is absolutely, astonishingly beautiful in that realm. But that's why when I discuss reincarnation in a few minutes, you'll understand how important that is. Because some people mistakenly believe that if they're having a terrible time in this world, all they have to do is commit suicide, and then they're automatically in this beautiful, loving place. Well, given that reincarnation is a tremendous part of the package, that's not how it works. Suicide only dodges the problems that will then be repackaged in the next lifetime. So suicide and homicide are never correct answers to any of this. Now, in that Gateway Valley, that was not the final endpoint of my journey. And this is very important, because what I realized was those swooping orbs of angelic choirs above, emanating these beautiful musical chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through me, just incredible power and awe of the love and beauty of that realm that goes completely beyond words. The words I use don't even hold a candle to what that reality is like. But of course, so many others have experienced that. There are millions in this world who have experienced near death and come back to this world to talk about it. Now, it turns out that those angelic choirs provided yet another portal. And I remember seeing all of the lower realms, four-dimensional space-time, and then that entire spiritual realm of the Gateway Valley with its deep time, a whole different order of causality. All of that collapsed down into this complex oversphere as I ascended through this higher portal up into what I call the core. Infinite, inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the divine love of that God force, the very source of our conscious awareness. But that love is something that goes far beyond any possible description. The good news is you can approach it with spiritual epiphanies, through deep centering prayer, through powerful modes of meditation, of going within consciousness. As you come to realize that consciousness is not created by the brain, but that we're really sharing a universal consciousness, that consciousness that you reunite with deep in the core realm, and that in near-death experiences, that is the very source of our awareness. But in that core realm, it was the most comforting of all, but it's impossible to put into words. That was a pure oneness with the divine, and with a sense of this complex oversphere of the whole multiverse throughout all of eternity, there to serve as a teaching point. And there was a brilliant orb of light that to me was there as a translator, interpreter, that helped me understand these incredible messages coming there. And the deepest part of that core really cannot be put into words. The best analogy that I can use for it is like standing on the edge of a black hole, where with one foot inside the event horizon, time is stopped, you're into an eternity, and who knows what in terms of definitions of space and all that. 1 foot outside of the event horizon, and you're just beginning to see how that core realm of pure unity of that God force starts to parcelate out into all of the lesser spiritual realms, finally getting to that densest form of this material realm. But the good news is, as sentient beings, we all have the ability to traverse those realms all the way to that core realm. Now, it turns out, in my NDE, that core realm, I would gain these tremendous lessons, insights, and then, without any explanation, I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, the place where it all began. That was a real mystery to me. But the good news was, I remembered the last time I was here, that musical melody rescued me. And by simply going into my mind and remembering the music, the notes, the simple melody, it was so perfect and beautiful. by remembering those notes, it would conjure up this portal that would appear again and usher me up into that Gateway Valley. And I would always encounter that beautiful girl, my guardian angel on the butterfly wing. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of. You have nothing to fear. And then those angelic choirs would provide the portal back up into the core realm for more lessons, learning different expressions and understanding all this. And yet then I would tumble back again. And it was learning a way of traversing those realms. Music, vibration, frequency. Humans have used music for tens of thousands of years to get into deep transcendental states of consciousness. Music has been a tremendous part of religious ceremonies, spiritual practitioners using music. I mean, there's an incredible role for music. And it turns out that that is how we navigate this. As spiritual beings, we can navigate those realms by using music, or at least what we would describe in this reality as something that is like music. It's important to point out, in those realms, you're not hearing with the ears. You're not seeing with the eyes. In fact, in kind of visualizing things, you can see all around at once. You can see through everything. You can actually see over time. All of it comes at once. That's why it's so hard to put into words. The ways that we come into knowing in those realms. Now, it turns out, though, that this did not last forever. This cycling all the way from Earthworm Eye View to the Gateway Valley and then out to the core and then back again happened several times. I don't know how many. But I was told every time I entered the core, you are not here to stay. You'll be going back. And it was something that I even came to believe after several cycles, that going back meant going back to that Earthworm Eye View. And so I learned this beautiful ability to use music, memories of music, and to traverse those realms. So I thought it's no problem that they keep telling me that I'll be going back. Well, there came a time when I would conjure up those beautiful notes down in the Earthworm's Eye View and try and get that portal to take me back up into the Gateway Valley. It didn't happen. So they weren't kidding. I wasn't there to stay. I would be going back. But I didn't know what back really meant. At that time, I was now stuck in this kind of Earthworm Eye View realm, very kind of murky and difficult to understand and navigate. And it was then that I had a vision of thousands of beings around me, arcing off into the distance, into the mists. And all of these beings, their heads were down. Many of them had their hands like this. Some were holding candles. And some had hoods. I remember this murmuring energy coming to me from all these beings. And it was very comforting. It was very surprising. Because in fact, that murmuring energy was very reminiscent of this beautiful, loving sensation I'd gotten in the Gateway Valley, in the core, of being perfectly at home, that you were deeply loved and cherished forever feeling, was now coming to me down in this lowest realm, through all of these beings around me. And when I wrote all that up, weeks later, as I was trying to record all my experience, what I called that prayer, I said I was feeling the impact of this prayer coming from all of these beings that was nourishing me and nurturing my soul and helping me to recover, to come back. Although I still had no idea where back was back to. Now, at the same time as I had those visions, I also would see 6 faces that came up out of the muck, and they came one at a time. And they were important in retrospect when I was first looking back on the whole journey there in the next few weeks, because they actually they served as time anchors. Sorry, did I miss something? Somebody whistling for their dog? Anyway. So these faces were of people that were physically present, family and close friends who were present in the ICU room the last 24 hours I was in coma. And so seeing these faces bubble up out of the muck, they would say a few words, they disappear. I didn't recognize any of them at the time, but I remember them perfectly. In fact, that image of their appearance to me is burned into my memory. I remember it now perfectly, as if it happened this morning. But they would come out of the mist and they would say a few words and then they disappear. I didn't understand any of the language at all. It was very confusing. One of them was actually a person who was not physically present in the ICU room. It was a very close friend of my former spouse's. And this woman, Susan Wrenches, who was the other face, she had done a lot of work doing what's called channeling, where she would help people who were in coma or had other medical things. She would go into a meditative trance. She even wrote a book about it called Third Eye Open. And now, of course, if she had talked to me about all that before my coma, I would have said, oh yeah, that's all great, nonsense. I didn't believe a word of it. But there she was, right on my journey. Susan was right there. And it turns out that my family had contacted her when I went into coma to ask if she could help. She was 120 miles away. She went into a meditative trance on the 4th and 5th nights of my coma. And I saw her appear to me as clear as any of them. So I remember when I was told that early on after my recovery from coma that Susan Wrenches was the one who was not physically there, I said, well, that doesn't matter. Of course, I knew by then that spiritual realm, we can completely transcend any kind of limitations on what we believe about space and time here. So to have Susan there was no surprise whatsoever to me. But it was really the 6th face that appeared that got my attention. It was a 10-year-old boy, and I didn't recognize him. It turns out that was that Sunday morning. It was the 7th day of coma. And by this time, the doctors were very discouraged. Nothing had really worked. In fact, anyone who knows about such cases of meningitis going deep into coma in just a few hours, the other thing you'll realize is by the 2nd or 3rd day, that patient is either waking up or they're dead. And I was still in that kind of limbo between, but my doctors were very concerned because I wasn't showing any positive signs of coming back. My neurologic exam was still very deep. The brain damage was very apparent. And that's why they held a conference that 7th day, that Sunday morning, with my family, where they recommended stopping the antibiotics. Because by then they estimated I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival, which they estimated that first day I got to the hospital. By day 7, I was down to a 2% chance of survival. But unfortunately, what that really meant was if I was in that 2% category and lived through this, all I would do would be spend the rest of my life in coma, be transferred to a nursing home where I would finally succumb to that illness. That's why the doctors recommended stopping antibiotics and letting nature take its course. Well, my son Bond, 10 years old, had been protected from the worst news during most of that week. They told him Daddy is sick. And when he saw his dad unresponsive on a ventilator, he knew sick meant something really bad. But they still hadn't shared with him how bad it was. But he was just outside the room when the doctors held that conference. And he heard it's time to let him go. And he knew now that things were really bad. He came running down the hallway into ICU bed 10, where I was lying there on the hospital bed, intubated, ventilated, eyes taped shut, and he pulled my eyes open. And one eye looking over there, one eye looking down there, neither one of my pupils responding. Those of you in medicine know that's a very, very, very bad sign. And I promise you, I did not hear him with my ears. I did not see him with my eyes. But he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. That was the 6th face I saw, deep in coma, was this young child pleading with me. And now I can tell you, for the entire journey, due to my amnesia, I had been absolutely fearless. I thought all of this can continue, or it can cease, it doesn't matter. And when I saw Bond's face that Sunday morning, pleading with me, even though I did not understand the words, I did not know who this being was, but I had a very powerful sense of connection that I had to come back for this other soul, that it was absolutely crucial. And that was the most terrifying aspect of the entire experience. Because I so far had basically come to understand just about nothing about my personal journey. There was a tremendous amount that had been revealed to me. But it was not about Eben Alexander's life. It was much bigger aspects of all this. As I said, that amnesia was a very important feature. And in retrospect, it became apparent why it was so crucial in my NDE. It usually does not occur in NDEs, but in mine it was especially prominent. And that's when I knew I had to come back to this world. It was that pleading from Bond. But when I came back, my brain was absolutely savaged. It was wrecked. I did not even recognize loved ones at the bedside. My mother, my sisters, my sons. I had no idea who these beings were. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough for you how extraordinary that was. And in many ways very frightening to come back into this world and then start putting the pieces back together. But the shocking thing, to my doctors especially, was what happened next, which is my language started coming back very quickly, literally within hours, a day. My language was back in tremendous form. And then what about my memories? I still had no memories of all of the personal memories of these family members. And it turns out that one of the after effects of my coma at that point was that I couldn't sleep. I was very agitated. And two of my sisters, when they moved me out of the ICU, two of my sisters decided they would sleep on cots in my room to try and help keep me kind of grounded and centered and try and keep me more comfortable because I was very agitated. And to do that, they would share, especially at night when I wasn't sleeping, they would share stories about family vacations we had and things like that. And initially, the stories were all just fascinating and beautiful, but I had no memory of them at all. But literally over a few days, all the memories started flowing back to me. And the amazing thing was kind of like a gently falling snow, because not only did my personal memories come back, and a lot of life experiences, but a lot of my semantic knowledge came back. Knowledge of cosmology and physics, knowledge of the brain and mind and neuroscience, all of this came back. And really by 2 months post-coma, everything was back. It was shocking. That was one of the things that absolutely dumbfounded the doctors who were reviewing my medical records and trying to make sense of it, was this complete and absolute recovery. But of course, they also had some notions of why that could happen. And so I was left with a tremendous challenge to understand all this and to make sense of it. My journey showed me, as a neuroscientist very familiar with the brain and its workings and with our modern understanding of consciousness, that consciousness is not created by the brain at all. And that, in fact, as I've said, memories are not stored there. That's a very important point that we'll make more sense of in a few minutes. So this is really all about the brain-mind discussion, the connection between brain and mind. And we tend to kind of take mind for granted, and we kind of assume that we have this physical world out there that is completely independent of us. So we see ourselves as physical beings that have this little 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath in here that's putting it all together for us. And we tend to believe that we are separate from the world. But that's where quantum physics differs tremendously. There is no separation. Mind is absolutely crucial to understand. In fact, all of this is occurring in mind. The physical world is a projection from the mental realm. And all this may sound a bit mysterious to you, but it is where the science is headed on all of this. It became very clear to me early on, especially in my meditative work after my coma and trying to make sense of this. You know, that little voice in our head, the linguistic brain, many of us identify with it. We think of ourselves as those memories and thoughts that are coming through our mind, the way we put the world together and understood it. And yet, that linguistic brain is just a tiny part And that is what shapes a tremendous amount of how we look at and interpret this world. The linguistic brain that I'm talking about, there really are two parts. There's Broca's area and the dominant frontal lobe. That's where we produce speech. All of my talking to you is being generated in Broca's area. But more important for this discussion is Wernicke's area, which is back in the dominant temporal lobe. Again, a very small part of the brain. If you're a polyglot, if you speak multiple languages, they organize around Wernicke's area in a concentric kind of bullseye pattern with your primary language right at the center. But the important thing to understand is that linguistic brain can be very seductive. Our rational, logical mind can kind of fool us into thinking many things that just are not necessarily so. And the linguistic brain, to give you an example of what happens to your understanding and realization of the universe when your language is removed, just read Jill Bolte Taylor's book, My Stroke of Insight. She was a neuroanatomist at Harvard. She had a vascular malformation, a tiny vascular malformation right there in Wernicke's area. And it ruptured back in 1996 when she was sitting at home. And she knew plenty of neurology. And she knew something very odd was going on, but as her linguistic center was being destroyed, tiny little hemorrhage, but right in the right place, she was sitting at a desk, and she started having a sensation that all of the room, the desk, the trees outside, all of it was her, was part of self. And she had this tremendous awareness of love, binding it all together. She gives a beautiful TED Talk. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen Jill Bolte Taylor's TED Talk, check it out. But what she describes there is a beautiful example of oneness with the universe, all by getting the linguistic brain out of the way. That is something I do all the time in meditation. I let my linguistic brain make a statement, an intention, ask a question for a given meditative experience, but then the linguistic brain goes into timeout. For those of you who, like me, before coma, feel that you're going to think your way to this understanding, read the books, watch the DVDs, go to the presentations, and think your way to figuring it out, that sets the framework, and it is important. But ultimately, the only way to come to a deeper understanding of all of this is to go within. And that's why I highly recommend meditation. I'll recommend more about that towards the end of the talk. But so this is all really switching the way we look at brain, mind, and consciousness. Quantum physics completely ups the ante, because if you follow materialist science strictly, none of us have free will at all. In fact, there is no such thing as consciousness. That's what Daniel Dennett or some of the other philosophers or proponents of hardcore physicalism, brain creates consciousness. That's what they would try and tell you. In fact, Daniel Dennett would say none of us are conscious, we're all zombies. Well, I think Dennett might be a zombie, but I don't think that's so for most of the souls in this room. I think we are conscious, and we're getting far more conscious. Now, in terms of this discussion of the brain not being the creator of consciousness, it's important to point out there's a very good model that works, and that is that the brain is a filter that allows consciousness in. But this scientific model that is emerging sees consciousness as something that is fundamental in the universe. And by fundamental, I mean that consciousness was there before that Big Bang that happened 13.8 billion years ago. Consciousness completely contains the emerging physical universe, including all of its creation and evolution. So that level of consciousness is a very powerful level of understanding that goes far beyond this material world. Now, it turns out that this kind of thinking, that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, actually goes well back certainly in modern neuroscience. Dr. Wilder Penfield, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of the 20th century, he was a towering figure in the 60s and 70s, or actually even earlier than that. And a lot of his work was done stimulating the brain in awake patients. Now, I've done a lot of those cases myself. They're called awake craniotomies, but in resecting tumors or vascular lesions, anything that's near a critical area, like speech areas, visual pathways, motor pathways, things like that, it turns out since the brain doesn't feel any pain at all, you can sedate the patient, lightly or anesthetize the scalp, and then do a big opening and open the skull, and then take the patient out of sedation, wake them up, and they're perfectly comfortable. And it might sound a little frightening to you, but I promise you, we have ways of doing this that are very smooth, so the patient is very comfortable, and we do it because we need the patient to be awake to test things like their speech and all of that. Now, what Penfield did in many of these cases, back in those early days, would be to electrically stimulate the brain. So you don't really get closer to the mind-brain connection than stimulating people's brains and then seeing what they experience, what they describe. And initially, Penfield thought he was hot on the trail of understanding memory, consciousness, and all that. But he soon came to realize that memory did not appear to be stored in the surface of the brain at all. In fact, towards the end of his career, he thought maybe it's stored down in the lower brainstem. But there's really no science supporting any of that. And that's why we're taking much bigger visions of this now. But in 1975, Penfield wrote a book called The Mystery of the Mind. And in that book, he makes it crystal clear that based on his long three decades or more of doing these experiments in patients, brain and mind, by phenomenal experience described by people who get electrically stimulated, he concluded that the mind is not produced by the brain. Not only that, free will, he was very definite. Free will is something that works with mind to operate the brain and all of our physical reality. But it's very important to point out, unfortunately, when Penfield wrote that book, Mystery of the Mind, he had just been diagnosed with cancer, and he succumbed to cancer the next year. And many of his colleagues thought that the cancer had influenced his thinking. But if you read that book, it's a very clear, scientific, and very erudite explanation of, no, the brain is not the creator of consciousness at all. But we've come a lot further from Penfield. I want to explain a few things that are evidence in our medical world on a daily basis that the brain is not the producer of consciousness. One is called terminal lucidity. This is something that happens in patients who have like Alzheimer's. Something like 5 to 10% of Alzheimer's patients demonstrate some form of terminal lucidity. I've heard this occurring even in patients who have been in coma for months, whose brain had been more than half replaced with metastatic cancer. With terminal lucidity, they come back to life. They wake up right there. They have beautiful communications and memories with family members at the bedside. They often have this kind of experience of waking up right at a time when they're seeing souls of departed loved ones coming to escort them over. So in some of the medical parlance, you'll hear this referred to as terminal delusions. But in fact, I can tell you that in many cases, it's absolutely shocking. It completely defies the notion that the brain is the creator of consciousness. And these are not uncommon. There's another set of phenomena called the idiot savant, or acquired savant syndrome. These are where some form of brain damage, whether it's head trauma, stroke, autism, what have you, but they unmask a superhuman mental capacity. Like someone could calculate pi to 3,000 digits in their head after a head injury, or would develop a photographic or eidetic memory to where they could look at a telephone book, look at 50,000 names and numbers over 10 seconds, and then report back to you the correct phone number for any one of those thousands and thousands they just looked through. So acquired savant syndromes are a beautiful example of how mental function is something that far transcends anything we can identify with brain function, and often brain damage is what unmasks these superhuman abilities. Now, the other main point I'd like to make about the brain not creating consciousness is a whole series of scientific papers that have come out in the last 7 years. In fact, one of them is referenced in the book Proof of Heaven, even though it's in the bibliography, even though my textual description of it all got stripped out by the editors before that book came out. But there have been several papers since then, but the original one in 2012 from Imperial College in London by Robin Carhart Harris and others, they were examining the brains of patients under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms, a very powerful psychedelic drug. And they all expected to find a brain going very active under the influence of these drugs because of the phenomenal experience that people describe. I mean, under the influence of those drugs, people can have extraordinary experiences that, in fact, they're now using psilocybin to treat things like addiction, alcoholism, nicotine, opiate addiction, and also treat fear of cancer, fear of death in cancer patients. And one dose of psilocybin can do an incredible job of fixing that whole problem for people. The addiction, the fear of death, and it's because of what I believe is it's opening that veil, allowing us to have that much richer communication with higher soul. And in the proper therapeutic setting, psilocybin can play a tremendous role in improving people's lives. Now, in these studies, though, the point I'm going to make is the shocker was they were using functional MRI, which is a very powerful technique for looking at the entire brain and seeing neural activity. And they also, in more recent papers, have used magnetoencephalography, which is an even better way of looking at neuronal activity. And universally, what these papers are showing from Imperial College London and from other centers around the world is the brain goes dark. Under the influence of psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and other psychedelic drugs, the brain shuts down. It gets out of the way. There's no place in the brain that becomes more active. Now, when I first read that paper in 2012, it made beautiful sense to me. I knew what happened when my neocortex was taken offline. So you can imagine how easy it was for me to foresee how if these drugs are decreasing activity around the brain, that would help to explain much more about the phenomenal experience that people have. But I hope that's telling you it's not coming from the brain. None of it is. The brain is better viewed as a filter. And that is not a new idea. It came from William James, who was a Harvard psychologist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He had investigated a number of cases of kind of spiritualism and other kind of extraordinary reports by people, communications with departed loved ones, etc. And he started realizing that you can't really look at the brain as the producer of consciousness, but that consciousness is something that is much more fundamental. And so I would say that William James, there were many other thinkers in the early 20th century, Henri Bergson in France, F.C.S. Schiller in England, Aldous Huxley in the United States. These were all scientific minds who came to see that the brain can best be viewed as a filter that allows that primordial consciousness in. And when you hear near-death experiences, for example, Jeff Olson tells a beautiful story of how he was in a horrific motor vehicle accident. And then he was taken to a hospital. His wife and his 2-year-old son had been killed in the accident. And he was going through a near-death experience of his own, but he was having all the thoughts of everybody around the hospital. He was walking the hall, and their thoughts would come into his mind. His veiling function was very damaged. And of course, I've already mentioned how life reviews are such a beautiful example of how our minds, in a sense, overlap, how we're really sharing one consciousness. And that's very reminiscent of what the founding fathers of quantum physics, like Max Planck and Wolfgang Pauli, Eugene Schrödinger, and John von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, and others. Sorry, Erwin Schrödinger. But they all said consciousness seems to be fundamental. That's something that emerges very prominently from experimenting in quantum physics. Now, it turns out that it's important to point out here a concept that we call consilience. Consilience is when you have widely disparate fields of investigation that seem to be converging towards one deep truth. And I would say that that certainly is the case when we consider what's known as the measurement paradox in quantum physics, the kind of notion of contextuality. I know that John Wheeler, who was one of the most prominent quantum physicists of the 20th century, who was the head of physics at Princeton, he came up with what he called the participatory anthropic principle. And what he was expressing there is that really knowledge in the mind is something that completely rises above this material world in a way that the mind determines, for example, how a photon coming from a distant quasar will behave in terms of demonstrating particle or wave characteristics, all depending on the mind of the observing scientist and how they set up the experiment to observe the photon. But the interesting thing is what Wheeler came to realize through experimentation and understanding the results of the experiments is that the photon doesn't even have any of those properties until it's observed by the observing mind. That's the contextuality part of this. And I don't want to go into too much detail on the quantum physics because we really don't have too much time, but I'll tell you that what has happened is there was tremendous debate back in those early years, in the 20s especially, between Einstein and Bohr and others, trying to make sense of quantum physics. And in fact, in 1935, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen wrote their famous paper on the EPR paradox, where they basically put out there that they thought quantum physics was just an incomplete theory, and that there were hidden variables that would travel along with the particles to explain the strange phenomena of entanglement, that in certain subatomic generation of particles, you could show that these particles are paired together in such a way that they almost act like one particle separated in space and time. And that is, of course, the deep mystery of the measurement paradox. But that's where this notion of the primacy of consciousness came from. And so when Einstein, they put this paper out and basically said that they thought hidden variables would explain it all, and it was a philosophical curiosity for decades. But then a brilliant Irish physicist, John Bell, came up with a famous inequality where he realized that you could actually perform statistical measurements on these particles and determine whether spooky action at a distance, entanglement, the connection of these particles completely defying our notions of causality in space and time were due to hidden variables that Einstein postulated, or that it really is entanglement, and that they're showing us something very deeply wrong about our notions of space and time. And so through Bell's inequality, there have been a number of experiments done that increasingly point the picture. And now we're really at a point where there's no denying it. There's been some beautiful writing in quantum physics. For any of you who are interested, I would especially steer you to the recent books by Bernardo Kastrup. He works out of the Netherlands. You can go to Bernardo Kastrup, that's with a K, and BernardoCastrup.com to learn more about that. But the scientific community, and especially those in quantum physics, have finally gotten to a point where idealism is the way they can see the universe working. Idealism means that there is causality, top-down causality from that mental layer. That is something that human beings participate in. But that is what generates all what emerges in our human reality here. And this is a tremendous shift. Another source for those of you who want to follow the recent science on this is GalileoCommission.org. If you go to GalileoCommission.org, you'll see a very beautiful set of papers that help to kind of put this together, showing the primacy of mind. But why is it important? The other side of consilience, in addition to the quantum physics, is coming from the other direction, the neuroscience of consciousness and philosophy of mind, and especially the proof of non-local consciousness. That is, things like telepathy. Telepathy is very real. Anyone who wants to read a fascinating book that will make that clear, read Guy Leon Playfair's book. It's called Twin Telepathy. And he estimates, based on his scientific work, that something like 35% of identical twins have a very powerful connection, telepathic connection, to the point where one of them might touch a hot stove, and the other twin, 1,000 miles away, can feel pain and develop a blister. So I'm talking about a very powerful psychophysical telepathic connection of minds. But it's not just between twins. I know that the day that I went into coma, I had met my birth mother, and I can't go into that whole story. I was adopted. My birth mother I first met a year before my coma, and we'd gotten to know each other quite well. I met my birth family. We had many visits together, but then we didn't see each other for a few months. She'd actually been on a business trip November 10th, 2008, and we hadn't talked probably in 3 months at that time, but she came home that night knowing something was wrong. She called and found out that I'd gone into the hospital that morning, deep in coma with meningitis. She knew that because we have a connection, a telepathic connection. People who are close in any form often have a telepathic connection like this. It's not just intuitive knowing of what the other is thinking. It's a way of discerning what they are experiencing now, even though they might be at some great distance. So telepathy is something that has a tremendous scientific basis to it. Completely defies our kind of conventional physicalist views of the brain and mind. Likewise, things like remote viewing, the psychic spy programs, remote viewing is something that allows people in the intelligence community to go into a state where they're able to discern information around the world, like a good friend of mine, Joe McMonagle, remote viewer 001 for the U.S. military, was able to look into Russian missile silos, was able to discern software changes in tanks that were their targeting systems, things like that. Just incredible abilities of discerning information. And it was scientifically studied. Dr. Jessica Utz, who was the head of the American Statistical Association in the year 2015, had done a lot of work, not only on remote viewing to show the reality of remote viewing, but she'd also worked with precognition, that in fact humans demonstrate an ability to know the future several seconds in advance in various computer paradigms. And she had proven that both of those are very well supported by the science and the statistics. But when she gave her talk to an audience of 6,000 members of the American Statistical Association from 62 countries around the world, and made it clear that this is beyond dispute, that remote viewing is absolutely real, even though it defies our conventional scientific understanding. And she asked them, how many of you have read the literature on remote viewing? Basically, none of them had. Why not? Because, it sounds like woo-woo nonsense. I don't believe in that. Well, would it take more data, or would it take a personal experience for you to believe it? And universally, they told her, personal experience. That is why meditation is so important, going within to cultivate these things. And this is something that my partner Karen Newell and I often talk about in our workshops. I'm hoping that Karen and I can come back to Budapest and share some of her work with sacred acoustics. That's her form of meditation. For those who are interested, I would recommend you go to sacredacoustics.com, and you can just follow everything from there to learn much more about how all that works. But basically, it's using differential frequency sound, that is slight differences going to the two ears, that creates a phenomenon that was discovered in the mid-18th century to give us, or mid-19th century, I'm sorry, by a Prussian physicist named Wilhelm Heinrich Duff. He discovered that slight differences in frequency going to the two ears can give a very profound kind of alteration in consciousness. People who were studying out-of-body experiences and remote viewing in the 20th century used these kinds of sounds, binaural beat, differential frequency brain entrainment, in a lot of their work. And I use these meditations, as I've told you, I use sacred acoustics an hour to a day, and have been doing that for years. I use it to revisit my near-death experience and to develop my relationship with all of that, with that infinite healing force, that pure God force of love. With my beautiful birth sister, I developed a tremendous relationship with her. Also with my father. Now, my father was not present in my NDE. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. And yet, in meditation about 2.5 years later, he became very apparent to me. That's a story that I tell along with a lot more in Living in a Mindful Universe. It's our third book. That's the one we hope to get translated into Hungarian so that Karen and I can make a trip back here and explain much more of this. But I promised earlier to kind of bring this together around a very important concept, and that is the concept of reincarnation. I've already told you how it was presented to me in my coma. And when I came back to this world, I had no idea that there's a tremendous scientific basis behind reincarnation. The work of Ian Stevenson and Dr. Jim Tucker. Stevenson was the head of psychiatry at University of Virginia back in the 1960s, and he investigated past life memories in children. Of course, he expected that he would uncover some kind of psychiatric condition that would explain it all. But what he actually found was that often the stories they remembered were very kind of exotic and inexplicable. There was no way to explain them from anything the child could have known. And then when they did homework, they found that they could identify the person who had lived before, that they claimed to be. And now, if you go to uvadops.org, University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, you will find in their literature more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children where the best explanation is of reincarnation. So obviously, from a scientific viewpoint, in the 21st century, we need to explain a tremendous amount to start explaining consciousness. But the good news is the scientific community is hot on this pathway. It will involve an annulment of that divorce I talked about a while ago between our intellectual, scientific, technological capabilities and our human sensibilities. Because we are spiritual beings in the spiritual universe. The way a quantum physicist would tell you is he'd say we live in a mental universe. You can go to Nature, the journal Nature, one of the most respected scientific journals, 2005. Richard Kahn Henry, who is the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins University, wrote an eloquent one-page essay on the mental universe. In other words, what we identify in science and quantum physics is top-down causal principles that govern all of the evolution of this universe. We are sharing one mind in this journey. The important thing that near-death experiencers would tell you is that we're all in this together. That the only thing that's important is taking care of each other. The more we can express love and show mercy and compassion, the more we will live up to the human spirit that is being defined by the emerging science. We've had 5,000 years for people to listen to prophets who had tremendous journeys of alternate realms, Christ, Muhammad, Buddha, Swedenborg, and others, coming back and telling us of other realms in a bigger world. But the most important thing to acknowledge is that deep lesson that comes from near-death experiences and comes from all of this analysis of the reincarnation literature and from our understanding of the world at large is steering us back away from the nonsense of materialist science and a false interpretation of Darwinian evolution that pretended that only the strong survive, and this is all about competing and crushing out your competitor. Well, any biologist today will tell you no, that survival in the biological world is all about cooperation and collaboration. And when you look at our world, and you look at Homo sapiens, we call ourselves wise, but is that really what we see as a result of the 4 centuries of the scientific revolution and these decades of the heyday of scientific materialism that tells us we're separate beings, that scientific materialism that says it's all physical, that our brain creates consciousness, that when you die, you're gone. That's the end of your awareness. Well, I'll tell you that is untrue. And the modern science of consciousness, steered by quantum physics, steered by neuroscience of consciousness, and by philosophy of mind, and all this extraordinary set of human experiences described by people living these lives, near-death experiences, shared-death experiences, which happen to normal people whose souls get sucked along for the journey, even to seeing full-blown life review of somebody who's dying, but in a shared-death experience, they come back to this world. These are all part of the emerging science of consciousness. If all you study is the material world, like the physics that I studied when I was growing up, what would you expect other than to think, well, we've got to somehow put consciousness as a product of the physical world? But when that doesn't work, which is exactly what we found, we need to realize consciousness is primordial. The brain is a filter. It's not the producer at all. We have responsibility for our choices, how we treat each other. We will come to reap what we sow when we leave this physical world. And those life reviews are all to gently nudge us back towards oneness with the divine, towards growing together, towards bringing spirituality back into human existence. And now that it's fully supported by the science, by quantum physics, and by this investigation of consciousness and human experience, that will lead to a tremendous revolution in human thought. It will lead to a far more harmonious world. And I'd like to close with a quote from someone you're probably familiar with, Nikola Tesla. And Tesla, I look at as one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. And I think in many ways he's been kind of shortchanged by scientific historians. But from my point of view, he was a brilliant thinker. And he said that when science begins to investigate non-physical phenomena, they will make more progress in the first decade than in all the previous history of science. And I submit we're at the beginning of that decade now. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and welcome you to a beautiful, optimistic future for humanity, where we eradicate warfare, where we become a far better steward for this planet, instead of threatening the existence of a third of the world's species and threatening warfare and destruction and all the horrific effects of climate change. I think Homo sapiens can finally become wise. Thank you very much for your attention.
Nagyon szépen köszönjük